Now we're going to go into Leviticus chapter 11 all the way to Leviticus 16. Okay, this is the last part of the first half of Leviticus. Leviticus, the first half focuses on the people approaching God. And remember, right, in Leviticus chapter 10, verse 8 to verse 11, we were told that one of the key roles of a priest is to show people and how to distinguish between either the holy, the unholy, the clean, and the unclean. So one of the roles is to help people distinguish over all these things. So in this portion, right, the emphasis will be why is there a need for clean and unclean. So again, right, we were going to just run through what the text say, and then after that, we're going to discuss about what is this whole teaching really all about. So obviously, the context of this clean, unclean idea, right, has to do with the presence of God falling upon the tabernacle. So it fell upon the tabernacle, and now the tabernacle has this idea that the holiness of God have descended upon the tabernacle. Somehow the people is now unclean, or rather impure people living in the midst of a pure God. Okay, so this idea about holiness. So here, the basic idea here was going to be about this idea of the necessity to cleanse, okay, the tabernacle. This idea about the tabernacle is an entity that houses the perfect presence of God, but the tabernacle is housed in the midst of people who could violate the holiness of the tabernacle. So the tabernacle is like a vessel. Okay, the presence of the people will actually contaminate the tabernacle and make the tabernacle unfit for God's presence. So that is the idea, the mental idea. And because of that idea, right, there's this idea that because of that, we need to cleanse. We need to make sure the tabernacle remains pure, and so that God's presence can continue to remain in us, among us. Okay, so basically two different segments. The first segment in Leviticus 11 all the way to 15 emphasizes on the idea about how, because there is uncleanness. Okay, later, don't worry, when we go to the end, we're going to explain about what's the concept of uncleanness. So because of uncleanness that can come from any of these four things: unclean animals, childbirth, diseases, discharges. Because of these things, it will cause people to be unclean. Okay, and this idea about uncleanness, remember, right, uncleanness is not necessarily sinful. Okay, uncleanness and sinfulness is not definitely not a synonym. It is not directly equated, although if you are sinful, you are definitely unclean. But uncleanness is more than just sinful. Okay, so it's important. So this idea about you can get uncleanness through these different means. And because there's these many ways that you could become unclean, there's a need for you to remember how you can be cleansed. Okay, so there's this important part. The whole entire worship in the idea of the Israelite focuses on Leviticus 16, on how there must be a purification of the tabernacle. The whole entire atonement focuses on the idea God wants to reside among the people in the context of the tabernacle. But if the tabernacle has been contaminated, God's presence can no longer remain among the people. So you need to have an annual exercise where you purify the you purify the tabernacle, you purify everything related to the tabernacle, and therefore make it available for God to remain among the people. So this is the segment, Leviticus 11 to Leviticus 16. The first portion, Leviticus 11 to 15, again, it covers four areas: animals, childbirth, diseases, and discharges. These four different areas where we're going to learn about how are we going to understand uncleanness through this. Okay, so again, right, we are not going to spend a lot of details within all of them. We're going to just focus on the major things in each category, but we want to focus on some of the important things that help us to understand the worldview about uncleanness. The most important thing in all these four, right, is basically the idea about unclean animals. Okay, unclean animals. This is the one of the most unique. Okay, because the rest of the uncleanness, like through childbirth, diseases, discharges, they immediately make you, any contact with all these things, they are contagious. Okay, their uncleanness is contagious. That means if you are an unclean person who have just have childbirth and you go and touch her, you will also become unclean. So that kind of uncleanness is contagious. But when you talk about animals, there's something very unique. Unclean animals are not contagious. You can touch a pig, which is an unclean animal. You can touch a pig and yet still remain clean. Okay, so there's something a bit unusual. So the first thing, the most important idea, right, in this uncleanness is that you are not told that you will be unclean through animals. The focus here about chapter 11 is just trying to help you to distinguish this idea about clean animals and unclean animals. Okay, this idea here. Okay, in the description, basically chapter 11, verse 1 to verse 8, gives you instruction on how to distinguish between land animals, which one are clean, which one are unclean. Then verse 9 to verse 12 focuses on water, fish type of animals. How do you distinguish between clean and unclean? And then verse 13 to verse 23 about animals that can fly. How do you distinguish between clean and unclean? This is very unusual because the whole entire first 23 chapters just focuses on the distinction of clean animal, unclean animal, and the emphasis is what you are able to eat. Okay, this idea, remember, the unclean animals is not contagious. You can touch an unclean animal and yet still remain clean. The emphasis here is just there are certain kind of food you cannot eat. There are certain kind of animals that you can eat. The visual concept, right, has to do with acceptance. You are able to accept, or you are able to take in animals that are clean, and you should reject animals that are not clean. You should not eat any animals that are not clean. Okay, by touching the animals alone does not make you unclean. The issue is the eating part, the accepting part. So the unusual thing is this: a lot of us have always wondered, why are certain food clean and certain food unclean? Why are pigs unclean? Why are ox clean? Okay, so generally, right, across Christian scholarship, there is generally 4 different ideas, 4 different ways that people have tried to explain why certain food are clean and why certain food are not. There are 4 different explanations. One is the most simplest, is the most direct. The first explanation given is it is purely arbitrary. That means no reason, don't ask. Okay, clean, unclean, none of your business, just follow the rule. Okay, so that's one way. In a way, right, this works as a last resort. That means, right, if you can't find any good reason, then you don't have a choice. You are supposed to, okay, then just obey law. Okay, but that, right, if that is true, then the law in this aspect, right, will not be able to serve the function as an object lesson. Remember, all this while we have been looking at the Leviticus law, we notice that the laws are seldom arbitrary. They are usually given to reflect some ideas. They are more like parables. Okay, as you do these things, they are supposed to lead you and point you forward to some ideas. So it is very unusual, right, for us to think about food law and just treat it as arbitrary. The other possibility is a religious sense. Okay, religious sense. In this idea, right, then the idea is that, certain food is used in pagan worship in other culture. Like for example, the Canaanites and the other Moabite, they use different kind of animals for their worship. So therefore, we should avoid using what they use for their worship. So the things that is rejected are the animals that are used for pagan worship. Okay, this is in a way, right, simply not true. Because in the ancient culture, there were a lot of cultures that used the goats, the lamb, the sheep, the cattle as their sacrifices. So for us to think that this is the reason for the clean, unclean food, that naturally will mean that all your sheep and all your goats should be banned as well, because these are very common worship animals for ancient culture. So this idea about a religious idea is probably not true. Arbitrary is a cough out. It's too easy. You have your religious reason, it is not true. Your third reason is a very popular reason, especially to modern years. Okay, in modern years, right, we often have this idea, oh, the reason why certain food is clean and unclean has to do with hygiene. If you have to do the hygiene. So the idea is certain food is unclean because they are unhygienic. God knows in advance that it is unhygienic, so God declared them unclean so that we are able to protect our health. But then, if that is true, right, it's very strange for Peter at the end in Acts chapter 11, I think, Acts chapter 10, to define that because now God will no longer differentiate between clean and unclean, suddenly the animals are acceptable now. Suddenly, right, the animals are no longer unhygienic. So it's very, very strange for God to think like that. It's very unlikely because there are a lot of animals that is being rejected that doesn't fall into that category, and yet it is still that way. One of the most likely reasons why certain animals are declared unclean and certain animals are declared clean has to do with a symbolic reason. Okay, this is a bit abstract. So the basic idea is this, okay, that there is a way that humans are supposed to behave. Okay, that would be the acceptable. Think about that there's a certain expectable, clean people. A person who is clean is someone who is righteous before God, who has a certain expected behavior. Okay, when you deviate from that expected behavior, okay, you are supposed to have a certain bearing, certain way you live. When you depart from the way you are expected to live, you are unclean. Okay, so think like a Jew and a Gentile. Okay, a Gentile departed from the way they ought to live, so they are unclean. So that idea, right, is brought out through the idea of the unclean animals. So the general idea is this: in every category of animals, either the land, the sea, or the air, the animals have a certain norm. Again, this is not a right and wrong. It's not like, oh, God declared that they are evil. They are not evil. The idea is that you are just declaring that there's a norm. For example, land animal, you have this idea that land animals, God gave them hoof to run. 2 legs and hoof to run. Okay, so this idea about this is the expected, this is the normal. Okay, this is the expected normal. They are domesticated, they are not wild. Anything naturally that depart from this norm, therefore will be unclean. Again, don't read it as sinful. We are just, have this idea, right? You depart from a norm. Okay, a norm that is generic. Anything that can fly typically have 2 wings and you have 2 legs to use for hopping or walking. So long as you have 2 legs for walking or hopping and wings, you are declared clean. And that's the reason why insects generally are unclean, but locusts is defined clean because they have wings and then they hop on their 2 hind legs. So the idea here is that anything that conforms to the regular pattern, okay, is deemed to be clean. Anything that depart from the regular pattern will be deemed as unclean. You are departed from the... So again, seawater, you are supposed to have fins and a tail to swim around. Anything in the sea that doesn't conform to the norm, the majority, the normal way, okay, will be deemed as unclean. So the whole idea, right, through the food, and again, remember, the animals themselves are not unclean. The issue is that you need to mentally distinguish there's a norm and a departing of the norm. Anything that depart from the norm should not be accepted. In the same way, that is the reason why Peter, by looking at the idea of the clean food, unclean food, when God told him that all food are clean, he is immediately able to make the link. It says that if there's no more any clean, unclean food, then what God is telling me, Acts chapter 10, okay, Acts chapter 10 verse 11 to 16, and then Acts chapter 10 verse 28, he immediately concluded, therefore, there is no distinction between Jews and Gentiles, expected and departing. All are before God in the same way. So the whole idea about clean, unclean has to do with representing the difference between Jews and Gentiles. The norm and the departing of the norm, the expected and the departation of the expected. So there's this distinction between clean and unclean. Again, this is important because unlike all the rest of the uncleanness, unclean food in and of themselves, unclean animals in and of themselves are not contagious. Okay, it's only when you eat the unclean food, then you will immediately be cut off because you have violated, you have accepted something that is not supposed to be accepted. Okay, so that is the idea. So that is the way for the people of Israel to think about their idea, the identity as Israel as set apart, expected wholly unto God, and the Gentiles as departing from God's expectation. Okay, so the distinction of animals is intended to symbolize the divide between the Jews and the Gentiles. Then the second half, verse 24 to verse 47, simply just focus on the only reason that you can get uncleanness, you can get contaminated from the uncleanness is only when you touch dead animals. Okay, if you have touched dead animals, even if you touch unclean animals who are alive, if it's alive, right, clean, unclean, it makes no difference. But when they are dead, it doesn't matter whether you're clean animal, unclean animal. The moment you touch the moment you touch a dead animal, you are unclean, except when it is ritually sacrificed. That means remember when you go to the tabernacle, you're supposed to bring your offering. When you kill the animal in the tabernacle, okay, when you're offering, that killing is not unclean, it is clean. But any other death, any other time you actually touch an animal that's dead, automatically you are unclean. Okay, so that's the idea. If you touch a dead animal, you're unclean. So the idea here, right, is no longer about the animal. Because the animal clean, unclean, it makes no difference. The issue is between dead and alive. Okay, so the idea here, very quickly, right, it gives the people the impression, this mental image that death itself is unclean. Death always violates the holiness of God. Death is something that is not norm, it is not good, it is not something acceptable. Death itself violates God's presence. So when you touch a dead animal, you immediately are unclean. So the whole important thing, right, is that it forces the people to be careful to avoid death. Okay, avoid death. The second part, chapter 12, verse 1 to verse 8, this is a part that is a bit controversial. This idea about uncleanness after childbirth. Okay, uncleanness after childbirth. Remember, for you to understand this, right, you must always remember, you cannot read the text as a sin offering. You read a sin offering is very weird. That means, right, when someone has children, he has committed a sin. How can this be, right, when God's commandment for us is to really procreate, have children and multiply? So having children is always in the Bible seen as a blessing. So here, right, the more right idea here, you have to understand, right, that the issue is not about sin, it's about purification. Okay, so the idea, again, let us remind ourselves, being unclean is not the same as being sinful. So a person can be unclean without being sinful. There's nothing wrong with being unclean. It is inevitable. It's inevitable. You are bound to touch a dead animal. There's nothing wrong. The Bible never fought you for it. In fact, when you touch a dead animal, right, all you need to do is to wash. All you need to do is to wash. There's no need for you to even offer an offering, a purification offering, because it is not something that is serious. So when it's not something to be serious, all you need to do is to wash yourself and wait until the evening, then you are clean. Okay? And in the time of that, right, during that period of time when you're unclean, it's not as if it's restrictive. You can continue to do whatever you want, you just cannot enter the tabernacle. Okay? So again, right, this idea of uncleanness is not a statement about sinfulness or guilt. It just talks about when you can enter into the vicinity of the tabernacle. Cleanness and uncleanness deal only with the tabernacle. Are you fit? Are you allowed in the tabernacle? So again, unclean animals, anyone who touch death cannot enter the tabernacle until the evening. The next day you can. When you talk about childbirth, in the same way, childbirth, right, the uncleanness is divided into two parts. If you have a boy, hey, if you give birth to a boy, you are the unclean. Again, two part. One part, the first part is the contagious uncleanness. Okay, that is 7 days. Okay, you give birth to a boy, you are contagious for 7 days. Anybody who touch you immediately are unclean. So it's to make sure everybody avoid, and you keep alone, you isolate. And then after the 7th day, okay, then you are unclean for 33 more days. But during that period of time, you are no longer contagious. People can touch you, people can talk to you, it's okay. Okay, you are no longer contagious, but you are just unclean. Again, remember, unclean, you are allowed to do whatever you want. When you are contagiously unclean, you just need to avoid not touching people. You are not to avoid contact with people, a bit like our case right now when we are trying to do social distancing. Okay, but when you talk about you are unclean for 33 days, you don't have to practice social distancing at all. It just says that you must make a point not to enter the tabernacle. That's it. Being unclean, that's all. Okay? So at the end of this, right, at the end of the period, and the amazing thing, an interesting thing is that if you give birth to a girl, your contagious period is 14 days instead of 7. And then your uncontagious period of uncleanness is 66 days instead of 33, double. So the total period of uncleanness for boys is 40 days. For if you give birth to a girl, it is 80 days. So everybody will start wondering, why is that unfair? So a lot of people who are like, wow, we are feminists, wow, equal rights. Or why is it that women have to be longer? Very likely, right, it is just a testimony, a symbol to reflect the idea that the women, the girls themselves eventually will have to give birth to people, will have to give birth to their own children, and therefore the mother will bear their uncleanness also. It's just a symbol in the ancient time. The whole goal, right, is very simple. Why is it considered unclean? Very likely because there is a discharge of blood when you give birth. Okay, so you are unclean. It just means that, remember this idea about blood? Okay, blood is something sacred in the religion. In Israelite religion, the blood is used to cover over sin. So if you just have a blood discharge, you are not able to enter. So that you are very able, your blood, so to speak, your discharge of blood will be kept separated, and you will not violate the blood that is used to cleanse the temple. Okay, so any form of discharge usually is deemed to be unclean. One of the main reasons why this is possible, is that in pagan religion, right? In pagan religion, sex and childbirth and fertility are often intertwined with religion. Okay? Again, we are not saying that God doesn't bless us with fertility. The issue is that in pagan religion, they see that as if we are participating. Okay, so because of that, right, because of a lot of pagan religion that has a lot of such rights concerning fertility, sex, childbirth, the Bible wants to clearly show a distinction that when you have these things, you are not sinful, but you are inappropriate. You shouldn't come near. Once you're not able to be near the tabernacle during your period, during your childbirth, immediately it sends a clear signal. While God blesses your fertility, fertility is not directly intertwined with worship. Okay, God blesses, but you are not participating. Okay, so that is a sense of judgment against all your pagan religion. That's why your pagan religion have child sacrifices, have religious prostitutes. All this because they merge your sexuality, orgies, and all this into their religion. So in Jewish religion, all these are clearly separated from worship. So there is this idea, after the period is over, after the period of purification is over, either 40 days or 80 days, then the mother will bring an offering. Okay, will bring an offering in order to signify the finish, the completion of the purification period. And this is important because the very first thing, verse 6 to verse 8, the first offering to be offered is a burnt. He's supposed to offer two offerings: burnt offering, purification offering. Okay, burnt offering, purification offering. And then the purification offering is strictly just a pigeon or a dove. Don't need to use an ox. Don't need to use a lamb. Just use a pigeon or dove. Doesn't matter whether you can afford, cannot afford. The whole idea and the reason this is important, three things is important. One, The order of the offering is important. Okay? If this is a sin problem, if it's a sin problem, the default order is always purification first. If you have committed a sin, you always offer purification before burnt offering, because you are not acceptable before God. But here, right, you are offering a burnt offering before a purification offering. So clearly, right, the issue is just a ritual uncleanness. There's nothing to do with sin. That's why you are allowed to offer the burnt offering is accepted. Then you do purification. Two, the mother, once you offer the offering, she is declared to be clean, but she's not declared to be forgiven. So again, right, signifying there's no sin involved. Okay, there's no sin involved. And third, there is no difference in value whether you give birth to a boy or a girl, right? Even though the purification period is longer, but the offering is the same pigeon or dove. Immediately, it gives you the idea that there's equal value. The issue why it's longer is not because the male are more prized and then the women are not important. That's why it's longer purification period. Okay, the period is different, but the value of the purification offering remains the same. Okay, either gender, it is still just a pigeon. Okay, so this is idea about the equality of the gender. So you have the unclean animals, and you have the unclean, being unclean through childbirth. The third is uncleanness through diseases, and these are the diseases, right, that is called skin diseases. Okay, skin diseases. So this is interesting because for the first half, right, chapter 13, verse 1 to verse 59, you actually have two lists. You have a list of skin diseases on humans. That will be chapter 13, verse 1 to verse 46. Okay, verse 1 to verse 46, basically the Bible just describes different kinds of infectious skin disease on humans. And then on 47 to 59, he actually describes skin diseases on clothing. Okay, this is interesting because the word skin diseases, right, is actually the same word. So as far as the Bible is concerned, right, they take the two to be the same. A discoloration of the surface. Okay, the idea about a skin, something that is surface that is not the right color. Okay, so somehow, right, you have an infectious skin disease among humans and how to deal with them. And you also have the skin diseases of garments and what to do with them. Okay, so that's the diagnosis, the different. So in a way, right, your high priest will serve as a doctors. They're supposed to look through all the different diseases and look different kind of way it's like and determine whether that is clean and unclean. Okay, so the whole entire list of different kind of skin problems. And then chapter 14, verse 1 to verse 53, now deals with what happened when the people heals. So when the person have this infectious skin disease, the person is unclean until it is solved. Okay, again, this idea, remember, unclean doesn't mean sinful. It just means they cannot appear in the presence of God. So the whole idea here, right, as you later we go and elaborate further, is how do you understand unclean? How are you able to distinguish between clean and holy? Okay, this idea about unclean and sinful, they are not usually identical. So again, right, and then in verse 1 to verse 32, the emphasis on purification for people who are healed of skin diseases. How are you supposed to purify them in terms of the offering? And then for verse 33 to verse 57, then you are dealing with houses that were infected. Okay, so you're talking about mold, you're talking about a termite infection, but after that, if they are well, if they are clean, the house is clean, then what should you do with the houses? So again, right, the idea here has to do with inappropriate. Okay, inappropriate in God's presence, not wholesome. Okay, not wholesome. Lastly, you have the issue concerning discharges. Okay, discharges. Discharges, we are talking about, the Bible describes it this way. Okay, chapter 15. Chapter 15, verse 1. It says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any man have an unusual bodily discharge. Okay, this word bodily, right, basically is in the literal Hebrew is discharge from his flesh. when the man have a discharge from his flesh. Okay, the word flesh basically means the genital. Okay, so in this context, right, the man have a discharge from his penis. Okay, so that's the idea, the discharge. So the word flesh in a lot of contexts, right, refers to the genital, the private parts. So when the reference to man, obviously it refers to the genital area. So this is in the context here. So the idea here is a discharge from the private parts or the genital area of both men and women. Okay, in this context here, verse 1 to verse 30 is a chiastic structure. It first talks about abnormal discharges of the man, and then he will talk about the normal discharges of men. Okay, normal discharges of men. And then for the women in verse 19 to 30, it will reverse. It will first talk about the normal discharge of women, and then followed by the abnormal discharge of woman, anything that comes out of its genital area. So obviously it starts with the man. Man, chapter 15, verse 1 to 15. If you have an abnormal discharge, okay, that means that certain thing comes out of your genital area that is not normal. Sometimes, right, most commentator would refer to this, right, very likely as gonorrhea. Okay, it's a sexually transmitted disease that causes you to have discharge from your private area. So the idea here is very likely it is contagious. So the idea, if you have an abnormal discharge from your genital area, you are contagiously unclean. Contagiously unclean means anything you touch also becomes unclean. So you are told to isolate and be alone and not touch things. And when people come and visit you, they have to make sure they don't touch the things you touch. So you are contagiously unclean until you are well. Okay, until you are well. And when you are well, what you do, right, is that you wash yourself. So for example, if the discharge stopped, okay, it stopped already, then you are supposed to wash yourself thoroughly. After it has stopped, you wash yourself, and then you wait another 7 days for it to be totally clear. Okay, after you are well, wash yourself, wait a total of 7 days. After you wait a total of 7 days, and then you give your offering. Okay, you give your offering, chapter 1 to chapter 15, verse 1 to verse 15. Okay, you notice what he says that in the verse 15, a priest is to sacrifice them. He's supposed to a sin offering and one for the burnt offering. Okay, and he's just supposed to bring 2 pigeons. Again, this idea, remember, if it's only a two young pigeon being used, right, it is a very, not a serious matter. Okay, when you talk about sin, right, usually you talk about ox, calf, you talk about a lamb. When you talk about 2 pigeons, okay, it just means that it is unclean, but it is not serious. So the purification offering, right, is actually very similar to childbirth. Okay, because the discharge of blood now is a discharge from genital. Once it's well, you just offer 2 pigeons. It shows that it's not very serious. Verse 16 to 18. Verse 16 to 18 refers to the male ejaculation. Okay, the discharge of semen. So it says here in verse 16 to 18. When a man has an emission of semen, basically either have sex with someone or somehow nocturnal emission, somehow you must bathe his whole body with water and he will be clean until evening. There is totally no need for purification because this is inevitable. Okay, so it's very normal for the man to have sex with the wife and there will be an ejaculation and there will be an emission of semen. All it happened is that the person is unclean until evening. The reason why until evening, because remember in the Jewish worldview, right, your new day start at evening. That means, right, when you say you are unclean until evening, it means you are unclean until the end of the day. The new day starts in evening. So evening is the start of a new day. So once you reach the new day, you are considered clean. Everything is clean from when you start new day. So you are unclean until evening, and then thereafter you are already clean. Okay, any clothing or leather that has semen must be washed with water, and then again it will be unclean. Verse 18, when a man has sexual relationship with a woman and has an emission of semen, both of them must wash with water, and then both of them, because the women also touch the semen, it will also be unclean until evening. You notice no purification offering needed. No need to go to the priest. So the emphasis there, right, is simply, again, remember we mentioned, in a lot of pagan religion, sex is always intertwined with religion. Okay, so because of that, the Bible wants to make sure it clearly distinguishes Worship is worship, sex is sex. Although God bless the sex, but then the idea here is that you do not mix the two together. Okay, you do not mix the two together. So there's this emphasis of, okay, if you have sex, you just mean that you cannot enter the tabernacle, but there's no need to offer purification offering. It is not a sin. Okay, it's not a sin. And then verse 31 to verse 33 just explain why this is so. Okay, let me go back to again. Then for the woman, verse 19 to verse 24 focuses on the normal discharge. So for the woman, the normal discharge basically is your menstrual period. Okay, when there's a discharge of blood, during that period of time, you are unclean for 7 days. Again, no sacrifices required. You are just unclean. That means you are not able to enter the tabernacle, more because of the issue of blood. Remember again, right, the issue is because of the sanctity of blood. Anything that has blood must keep away from the tabernacle. Okay, so again, it is just unclean. And then verse 25 to verse 30, there is an irregular discharge, a discharge that is not your normal menstrual period. Then you are unclean, same as the man. That's abnormal discharge. You are unclean until the discharge has been solved. Okay, so that's the idea here. And then when you go to verse 31 to verse 33, the emphasis is you must keep the Israelite, verse 31, you must keep the Israelite separate from the things that make them unclean. That is the role of the priest. One of the role of the priest is to keep on teaching the people so that the people learn how to distinguish clean, unclean, so that they seek to keep themselves clean. Okay, so that they will not die in their uncleanness by defiling my presence. This is important. By being unclean, you are not being sinful. No one is ever judged for being unclean. Okay, remember that. No one is being judged for being unclean. You are only judged for being careless with your uncleanness. You are only judged when you are unclean and you enter the tabernacle. Okay, that means you are not able, you are unclean, you are not supposed to, and then you enter. The emphasis is that someone who is careless with God's presence. A person who is unclean is nothing wrong. No one will get judged for being unclean, but you will get judged if you are unclean and you violate God's holy presence. Okay, so these are the regulations for a man and a woman. Okay, so this idea here. Okay, so these are all the different emphases on clean and unclean. Later, as we wrap up, we're going to talk a little bit more about what is the significance of all this. As we move on very quickly, then the last part of our Bible in this segment, Leviticus chapter 16, will now focus on this idea. Again, remember the whole transition of the text. Leviticus chapter 8 to chapter 10, it describes this idea about the role of the priest. Chapter 10, verse 8 to verse 11 emphasizes that the priests have a role to teach the people about clean, unclean. So you'll be wondering, then what do you mean by clean, unclean? And then chapter 11 to chapter 15 explain 4 categories, important categories where you need to distinguish between clean, unclean, so that people who are unclean, you are not supposed to come near to the tabernacle. That's all it requires of you. Okay, you don't need to do anything. There's no sin. There's no repentance required. You just need to make sure you avoid the tabernacle for a limited period. Okay, then you're no problem. Okay, then verse 16 is where we go back to the story. Okay, this is important. Okay, the book of Leviticus, right, has only 2 narrative portions. We already mentioned, right, the whole entire book of Leviticus is a running commentary of instructions. 27 chapters of instructions to people and to the priests. Within these 27 chapters, there are only a very short segment where there is a narrative. There is some account of stories. Verse 10 is one of them. And then the other one is verse 24, chapter 24, where you talk about the blasphemer being put to death. Okay, that's the only 2 narratives. So here, right, in chapter 16, it starts this way. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron who died when they approached the Lord. So straight away, right, it's as if, right, the middle portion, chapter 11 to chapter 15, never occurred. Okay, the story immediately continued to, therefore, what Moses was told to inform Aaron. So the whole entire thing in chapter 16, right, then will emphasize on, you know that at the end of the day, right, no one is qualified to enter God's presence because we all have uncleanness. We all will get certain things because of our life on earth. There's sexual relationship, there is discharge of blood, and then somehow we will not be appropriate, not wholesome, and we are not able to enter the whole entire presence of God. But then, right, once a year, God will accept an atonement. Okay, once a year, God will accept a representative to cover over all this uncleanness so that the whole tabernacle is clean again. That is the Day of Atonement. Okay, the Day of Atonement, chapter 16. This is the very, very important part. This is the highlight of the whole entire sacrificial system. We all want to approach God, but as we approach God, we inevitably will bring our uncleanness and contaminate God's presence. So therefore, once a year, God will purge away all this uncleanness so that His holy presence will not be violated among unholy people. Okay, so this is the important part. 3 major areas we will run through very quickly. Again, this is just have an overview of atonement. There is basically 3 parts. 1, the preparation, and then the wrapping up. We'll run through very quickly, but the most important part is the middle part where we talk about the actual cleansing of the tabernacle. Okay, the actual cleansing of the tabernacle. So here in the preparation, in verse 1 and verse 2, the most important part, verse 1 and verse 2 just focuses and just Moses reminding the high priest Aaron that even you are not able to enter the tabernacle, the most holy place. Even you are not qualified to enter. But that doesn't mean you will not be able to enter, because once a year you are going to enter, but to do certain things. Okay, so the whole entire Leviticus 16 describes that one day a year that the high priest will represent God's people to go straight into the most holy place. Hebrews tells us that this thing is very important and it happens once a year as a reminder to the people of God that it is not completed, it's a regular occurrence. So one day a most qualified high priest will come and he will do it once for all, and that's Jesus Christ. But that idea, the Day of Atonement, so there's 2 preparation. There's 2 preparation that is needed to be done. One is the preparation of the high priest. Okay, the preparation of the high priest. So here in the preparation of the high priest to enter, what he will need to do, 1, the high priest, right, needs to prepare animals required for his own offering. Remember we mentioned that if I am offering that offering on my own behalf, the high priest is supposed to produce the animal. But if he is offering as a representative, okay, he's offering the animal for the whole community, then the animal must come from the community. Okay, so this first half, he prepared the animal required for his own offering, verse 3. Then verse 4, he wears his sacred garment, and that is not the one that is very elaborate, it is the one that is most modest, because he's going to enter into the tabernacle. In the Day of Atonement, the high priest is not representing God. During the Day of Atonement, the high priest is representing all of Israel. He's representing men. So he dressed in a very simple, non-fleshy white garment to symbolize his solidarity with all people. Verse 5 to verse 6, he's going to receive the animals from the people's offering. So he's basically, I prepare all the animals, I put on my dress. So that is the preparation of the high priest. Then the second preparation is about the 2 goats. The Day of Atonement requires 2 goats for the purification purposes. Okay, again, don't read it as sin offering. It's a purification offering. So there's 2 goats that's involved in the purification offering. 1 goat will be done alive, 1 will be dead. Okay, the one that will be dead will be sacrificed as the purification offering proper. The other one that is left alive will eventually be your scapegoat. Okay, both of them are important. So there's 2 goats. You basically draw lots to see which one is which one. Okay, you're just drawing lots. Then moving on, this is the most important part. This is where the whole entire Day of Atonement focus on. What is actually going on in the Day of Atonement? The Day of Atonement is essentially the cleansing of the tabernacle. Again, just imagine this idea. God is holy and he stays in the tabernacle. The tabernacle is the link. Okay, the physical tabernacle is the link between God's presence and us. As we who are unclean in the community, we will contaminate the tabernacle. And once we contaminate the tabernacle, God's presence no longer can reside in the tabernacle, because the tabernacle is no longer fit for God's presence. So therefore, once a year, you need to cleanse the whole entire tabernacle so that God's presence, holy presence, can continue to remain through the tabernacle. So the important thing is the cleansing of the tabernacle. Okay, so the idea here is that the first thing that is done is the purification offering for the high priest. Okay, this important part is like verse 11, he has to offer the bull, a large animal, a bull, the whole big bull, for his own behalf, because he is the leader of the community. His offering, therefore, is going to go into the whole holy place, most holy place, and therefore it symbolizes that he is going to bring a lot of contamination into the whole presence of God. So therefore, he offers the most expensive animal within their herd in order to reflect the type of violation that he is going to do. Okay, he offers that. He uses the incense. He's going to go to the holy place. There's an incense, an altar of incense in front of the curtain that divides the holy and the most holy place. He's going to now take the incense, put the coal, and then this hand, right, is going to go into the curtain. His person is not going in yet. He's going to put his hand into the curtain, into the most holy place, and allow the smoke to fill the whole most holy place. The Bible says that this is so that he will not die. The assumption is he is not allowed to look directly into the presence, into the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so he's supposed to see a lot of smoky, and quickly do what he needs to do, and then quickly get out. Okay, so the smoke is to make sure he's not glazing at the perfect presence of God. Okay, so that's the symbol. So he did that, and then he's going to take the blood from the sacrifice of the bull, his own blood, the own sacrifice. He's going to take the blood, and this time around, instead of just putting outside on the altar or spill outside, he's going to bring the blood all the way to the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, and sprinkle the blood 7 times to symbolize that we have violated the most holy place, and therefore this blood will cleanse, will cover over, okay, will pay for the violation. Okay, so this is meant to purify the most holy place. The bull went in to purify the most holy place. And this is the only time in the whole entire year that blood ever enters the most holy place. Okay, this is the only time the blood will go into the tabernacle. The tabernacle is supposed to be clean. Okay, totally no touching. And then that is the only day blood will enter. Okay, so that is the purification of the high priest, because the high priest later is going to represent the people and go in. So he has to purify the most high place first, okay, the most holy place. The second offering is the offering. This is the goat that is meant to represent the purification for the whole community. This is the goat that eventually we are talking about Jesus taking the sins of the world. Okay, so in this story, in this purification, the goat basically, verse 15, take over the sins of the world and therefore die on behalf. It's a purification. It actually purifies the people. Okay, so he represents, it's an offering for the people. Now, in the same way, some of the blood of this goat, which is an offering for all the people, some of the blood is taken. Again, you go straight into the most holy place and you use the blood and you sprinkle on the Ark of the Covenant and in front of it as a symbol that we have violated God's presence, and this goat is a purification sacrifice to cleanse what we have violated, is to cover over all the violation that we have done. Verse 18 and 19. Okay, verse 18 and 19 is important. So again, remember the bull went in, come out. The high priest now will sacrifice the goat on behalf of the people. Again, go in and come out. Okay, so now he's outside the most holy place. He came out and now he's in the holy place. Okay, in the tabernacle, but in the holy place. Now he's going to take the blood of both the bull and the goat, and combine and take the blood and sprinkle and do the same to cleanse the holy place. So by saying that, right, very likely what it meant is that you're going to take the blood, sprinkle 7 times on some of the artifact, very likely the altar of incense, okay, or maybe some of the other things, but you sprinkle the blood 7 times to symbolizes that the holy place is also cleansed. Then the Bible says you're going to come out, okay, you're going to come out outside the tabernacle, now into the courtyard where the bronze basin, bronze altar is. Okay, bronze altar. Then again you take the bull and you take the goat's blood and you take the blood and you again cleanse the altar. So basically you come from the inside, cleanse the most holy place, cleanse the holy place, and then cleanse the rest of the tabernacle area. So the emphasis you notice, right, all the purification has to do with how the tabernacle has been violated. Okay, God's physical presence on earth has been violated, and therefore it will make God unable to stay among us. But the purification offering purifies the tabernacle and therefore allow God to remain with us. Okay, so that's the importance of the purification offering. Then after that, right, you have this scapegoat. This is the one that where our English word scapegoat come from. Okay, this idea in verse 20 to verse 22, there's this incident where so that means, right, the whole entire Day of Atonement is divided into 2 major halves. In the first half, the purification offering of the high priest and the purification offering of the people, you will notice that everyone gathers to watch the ceremony, but none of them has to do anything. That means your responsibility is merely to witness. But once you go to the other one, the people, someone among the community is supposed to represent the community to do something. Okay, this scapegoat, there's this scapegoat, what will happen is the one that's dead will be sacrificed as the purification offering. Then there's another goat that is alive. So this goat that is alive, okay, this goat that is alive, what he will do, the high priest is supposed to take both hands, hold the horn to symbolize the transference of all the sin and guilt of the community over this live goat, and then someone appointed for the job. That means someone who is chosen beforehand. And this someone is clearly one of the community. We're not talking about a priest. Someone among the people will take that goat and take it all the way to the wilderness. Okay? That man has only one job. Take it to a place and let it go such that the goats will never be able to return. Okay? By law, by right, okay, by right, you are not supposed to kill the goat. Okay, you are not supposed to kill the goat, but then obviously later tradition, they do that so that to prevent the goat from coming back. But in the law, right, there is an emphasis that you are supposed to let it go. Let it run into the wilderness. The whole focus, because you let it go alive, there is always a living possibility that the goat will return. Okay, so the man is responsible to bring the goat as far as he can, such that the goat will never be able to find its way back. So that is the emphasis. The emphasis basically symbolizes that we are supposed, now that the tabernacle has been cleansed, you are supposed to purge the presence of sin from your community. It symbolizes the desire, the commitment to purge the sin from the community as far as you can, such that sin cannot find its way back. Okay, that is the emphasis. So how far you want to bring the goat depends on how committed you are. In the same way, how far should you stay away from temptation? That really depends on how committed you are to avoid the sin in your life. Okay, so the emphasis of that purging of the presence of sin, and with that purging, the whole entire ceremony is over. Purification for high priest, purification offering for the people, and then the purging of sin from the community. After that, there is a cleansing of the participant as a wrapping up. Everyone involved in the ceremony, including the Aaron, the man who actually led the goat into the wilderness, all these people are supposed to wash themselves, okay, as a symbol of cleanliness. Okay, you clean yourself and then you are clean. Okay, verse 29 to verse 34, the duty of the people, it just, because remember, right, when you describe the whole entire ceremony, technically only two persons have the most things to do. One, the high priest. Two, the man who is leading the scapegoat away. So because of that, right, the Bible in verse 29 to 34 emphasizes on what's the responsibility for the rest of us. It says, on this day, you must deny yourself and not do any work. So the few emphasis, you are supposed to deny yourself, fast basically. You're supposed to deny yourself and you are not supposed to do any work. It's supposed to be a Sabbath. Deny yourself, fast, and there is a Sabbath. Consecrate yourself, and then verse 32 to 34 reminds us that this is a lasting ordinance. You have to do it every year, and this is important. Anyone who doesn't attend this ceremony will be cut off from the community. That means you will have been put away from the community. You are no longer part of Israel. This is an important ceremony, yearly event for the people of Israel, because your whole entire sacrificial system accumulates in the atonement. Just as how we talk about we want to be in God's presence, there's a priest, everything hinges on what enables us to be in God's presence. Since we are unclean people, we are unable, we are unholy, why are we able to have the presence of God in our midst? Because someone or some goat or someone have atoned for our impurity. Okay, so that is the one of the most important highlight. And this is the one, right, that eventually became the understanding of Christ as a redemption, as redeeming us. Okay, so some key important teaching that we can learn from this teaching, this whole entire segment on cleanliness. One, we need to understand is the significance of uncleanness. We need to understand the significance of uncleanness so that we understand what is being mentioned, what is the focus of this whole entire laws about cleanness, uncleanness. Two things we want to learn. Again, remember before that, the background is that the presence of God, holy presence of God means that you have a holy God in the midst of unholy people. So however you start, you must always remember that is the starting point. God is holy, and yet He lives among rebellious people. So that is the starting point. So the first thing, cleanness is the demand of God's presence. Okay, it's the demand that God's presence have. Once God is holy, He demands that those people that comes in must be clean. Okay, must be clean. So the first thing has to do with cleanness as the demand of God's presence. I think we all remember this picture that we learned about when we talk about the tabernacle in Exodus. Okay, when we talk about Exodus, this idea, right, that the Bible uses space and people to talk about a concept called clean, unclean, holy. So by dividing the whole place into inside and outside the camp, you put the people away from the camp, you allow people to come into the camp, or people outside the community of people, of believers, and within the people of Israelite. So you immediately have this idea, people outside are considered to be non-Israel, and people inside are considered to be Israel. People within us is Israel, people of God. People outside of us are not the people of God. So you are using a spatial way, right, to help them understand the distinguishment between clean and unclean. So, and this is in the same way the Bible description. And remember, this is basically how Peter drew that connection. Gentiles are unclean because they are not appropriate. Israelite must observe cleanness. Okay, this idea of cleanness. So again, right, remember, don't read it as sinful and not sinful. The idea is that you are conforming to God's expectation so that you can enter His presence. Gentiles are not conforming, and therefore they are not able to enter God's presence. Unclean and clean. Outside versus inside. Okay, so clean and unclean. So cleanliness, right? Cleanness is a default setting. Cleanness is a default. If you find things that violate that cleanness, you depart from the expectation, then you become unclean. And then yet, within the cleanness, you have an inner space in the Bible, in the Leviticus, that's called the tabernacle. A space that is within, nearer to God's presence. And somehow, right, this idea that only the priest can enter the holy place. Okay, so straight away, you have this concept that not everyone can enter. As you enter, it requires holiness, set apart. Okay, so straight away, right, using that 4 terms, holy, clean, unclean, the people of God have a mental picture that if we ever, tabernacle representing God's physical presence, okay, the tabernacle proper, the holy place, if the priest alone can enter, if we want to enter and approach the holy presence of God, the very minimum is that we must be clean. We must be clean and maintain our cleanness. Only clean people can contact holy. Okay, only clean people can go into the tabernacle offer, so that only clean can ever contact holy. Okay, and then on the other hand, you'll see consistently, anyone who is unclean must be separated from people who are clean. You are not supposed to, if you treat uncleanness, people who are unclean, you're supposed to isolate yourself, and people who are unclean must never contact the holy. A person who is unclean must never approach the tabernacle. So you can see, right, the whole entire rule surrounding the presence of God and uncleanness is simply summarized in this one thing. In no way should uncleanness ever contact holy. So cleanness is the one that caused that division. It is barring the division. You're supposed to be that bridge. No one who is unclean should ever have an opportunity to touch. Once who is unclean, you have to stay away from the tabernacle. Okay, stay away from the tabernacle until you are clean, then you are able to approach holy. Okay, so that is the idea that is meant to symbolize the expectation that is demanded on the people of God simply because God's presence is holy. The presence of God's holiness demands that things that is not appropriate should not come near to holy. So this is supposed to be, again, remember, this cleanness, uncleanness, you should never describe it or understand it in the form of sin and sinless. The issue is always about this idea about appropriateness. How far can I go? So someone who is going nearer and nearer, only the high priest once a year will go in straight into the most holy place. And even the high priest himself cannot enter the most holy place at will. That's the emphasis. So this whole entire about cleanliness just emphasizes the idea about how do we approach, what do we need to do, how should we behave, what do we need to avoid, so that we can contact the holiness, can approach the holy presence of God. So here again, let me reiterate, cleanness is totally not related to sin. But then, what then is sin? Sin is knowing this expectation of God that unclean things should never touch the holy. Sin is being careless about God's holiness. Sin occurs when you are unclean and you approach God's presence. That means you are careless about God's holiness. And that's the whole function of this whole idea. Okay? Because we will inevitably be unclean. For ladies, your period. For men, having emission, you have skin diseases, you have a rash. We will always have reasons to be unclean. We will touch a dead animal. And it's not a fault thing. It just means that once you know that you are unclean, you will just have to avoid the tabernacle. Because by doing so, right, it shows that you are careful about God's presence. If you are trivial, you take God's presence very lightly, then no matter what happened to you, you will just take it that, doesn't matter, God won't care, and you will enter. That is sin. So from what we know, sin therefore is not uncleanness. Sin is being careless about God's holiness. If you violate the law of cleanliness, okay, remember the law of cleanliness is not trying to avoid all uncleanness. It's that unclean people should not have access to God's presence, but if you violate that commitment, that commandment, that unclean don't come near, then you are being careless with God's presence. You are being careless with the holiness of God, then you will be judged because you have violated God's holiness. This is similar to the 2 older sons of Aaron compared to Aaron himself. When you are careless about God's presence, this idea about clean, unclean, and holy. Okay, so this is the whole entire picture of basically how they are related. Anything that's unclean All it needs to do is to be cleansed. Then you will become clean. Okay, but when you are clean, right, everything that's clean and unclean are common. Once you are clean, you have the possibility of being sanctified, and then you will be holy. If something that is holy is trivialized, then it will become profane, that means make common. Okay, then he will remain back to clean. But if there is pollution, uncleanness, then that thing that is clean will become unclean. Okay, so that is the whole relationship. But the whole goal, remember, at the end of the day, right, is that the holy and the unclean must always be kept apart. That is the focus. And that whole entire object lessons is supposed to teach Israel that God's holy presence have a certain demand, and we should never bring something inappropriate into God's holy presence. Eventually, that idea will extend itself into our sin. We cannot go into God's presence with our sin and yet expect to live. Okay, so that is eventually extended to that idea. But here and foremost, the whole idea is about sin being careless about God's presence. So this is an important idea. Okay, this is an important idea that as you go back and think about how do we understand clean. Again, remember, don't equate clean and unclean, or unclean. Don't equate unclean with being sinful. Okay, it's totally not really directly related. The second thing we can learn about this whole entire lesson is about Jesus' role as the atoning sacrifice. Jesus in the Bible is deemed as the atoning sacrifice. So there's these two ideas. Jesus as atoning sacrifice. So there's this idea that he serves as the mediator of the entire. The book of Hebrews call it well. He has two roles in this whole entire Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is meant to symbolize the coming of Christ. His sacrifice on the cross for our sin. So you have this situation, the book of Hebrews tells us, Jesus himself is our great high priest. The whole entire repeated emphasis that the high priest needs to sacrifice a bull in order to enter God's holy presence signifies that he is not qualified to enter. He still needs a bull to die on his behalf, then he's able to enter. So that means, right, Aaron and his children and his descendants will never be able to be accepted without someone purging his contamination. He is not perfect. But Jesus is our great high priest. The Bible says he lived a sinless life, and therefore without requiring an offering, because no one can pay for him. Without requiring any purification offering, he could enter God's holy presence. He is sinless, he is perfect, and he was able to enter God's holy presence. This is important because anyone who is not qualified to enter God's holy presence cannot be our mediator. So that is the repeated emphasis in the Bible, that we have a great high priest who must be, again, he must be one of us. And that's the reason why Jesus must come as a son of man. He must be one of us to represent us as our great high priest, and he must be totally acceptable to God. He must have lived a sinless, unblemished life that he could enter God's holy presence without any requirement for purification offering, because no one will be able to die on his behalf. So Jesus is our great high priest. He is able to enter God's holy presence, and then the Bible in book of Hebrews says he in turn, after he entered into the God's holy presence, he in turn offered himself as our purification offering. He came and offered himself as an atoning sacrifice. Why is this important? Because Jesus' blood as the goat is fully able to cover the sins of the world. Again, the book of Hebrews. Here, the book of Hebrews talk about Jesus as our high priest and Jesus as our perfect sacrifice. Okay, so in our story, Aaron is the high priest and he brings a lamb. Jesus entered on his own behalf without offering and then used himself as that purification offering. So all this is only understandable if you understood Leviticus 16. Why is there even a need for atoning sacrifice, because our sin has violated God's presence. Unless someone come and cover over our violation, God will never be able to accept us into His presence. And Jesus came along and played that role as our mediator, okay, to allow us and to enter into God's holy presence. So this is the second last part. The very, very last part, just a quick idea, is just to really understand the nature of the atonement. Okay, we need to understand the nature of the atonement. Remember, the atonement has two parts. The Bible emphasizes the atonement has two goats so that we understand the atonement has two portions. The first portion of the atonement deals with the priests representing the people and what they are supposed to do. The goat paying the penalty of our sin. In that way, right, the atonement is focusing on the substitutionary aspect of the atonement. That somehow a goat must represent us and die for our sin. Okay? And then on the other hand, you have another goat, a scapegoat, who will now carry our sin and be sent far away. In that way, right, the atonement is symbolized with cleansing. Is purging. Okay, so these two aspects are important. So when we think about atonement, when we think about we are forgiven and God came and do this for us, it actually have two different ideas. One, when Jesus come and die as a substitute for us, He has successfully averted the wrath of God. That wrath of God that is poured out against sin, when He becomes our substitute, the wrath of God on us is averted and is turned to Him instead. He bared the brunt of the wrath of God on our behalf. He took the penalty of sin. And yet on the other hand, the scapegoat that carried the sin and is sent into the wilderness is symbolizing the purging of the presence of sin. So atonement focuses on paying the penalty of sin, but it is also cleansing, focusing on the purging of the presence of sin. So in other words, right, atonement has two aspects. Atonement has the aspect that is dealing with justification. Jesus died on our behalf to pay the penalty of sin. Atonement also carries with it a desire of sanctification. It covers with it the idea that now that God has cleansed the presence, has paid for the penalty, therefore our value, our desire must be to purge sin away from our life. It has to do with the desire for sanctification. Justification, sanctification. Atonement is the dividing point. We paid all the past, and going forward, we must purge sin away from our community. So therefore, right, it is not right for someone to think that, oh, I have been forgiven. Okay, God has died for me, but I don't need to deal with my sin because God has forgiven me. It doesn't matter anymore. You notice there is two goats. One dealing with the penalty of sin. Two, dealing with the purging of sin. It is significant that when you talk about substitution, the high priest represents the people to sacrifice. But when you deal with the scapegoat, one from among them, the people themselves are responsible to take the scapegoat as far as they can. There is a significance. That means whatever is done to the scapegoat is not the responsibility of the priest. It's the responsibility of the people. The people must communicate their commitment of this cleansing by purging sin from their community. So salvation is directly connected to sanctification. A person who experiences God's forgiveness will also reflect that forgiveness in a desire that he wants to purge sin from his life. The sense of, I want to live a life that is pleasing to God. So there must always be that element. So a person who doesn't purge the presence of sin have not experienced the atonement. Okay, so that is the symbol of atonement. So with that, very quickly, so therefore, right, the entire sacrificial system in the whole of Israel is basically accumulating in the Day of Atonement. We have the sacrifices. What do you need to do as you approach God's presence? Then there's a priest that is supposed to accept the sacrifices on your behalf. And then the priest has a role to teach about what is clean and unclean. And now you talk about how we inevitably will be unclean. There will be things in our life that will be unclean, and therefore there must be a purging of our contamination. We contaminate the holy presence of God because of our unholy presence, and therefore there must be an annual purging of of all this contamination, so that the tabernacle can be cleansed and be worthy of God's presence. So the whole entire system accumulates in this idea of atonement. So all our understanding and talk about the holiness of God, God's presence, everything accumulates on. Therefore, it is inevitable that we will not be able to enter God's holy presence because we are unholy people. We are not perfect. We have lapses in our life. We are bound to create contamination. We are bound to sin. And therefore, we are not able to have God in our midst unless atonement happens. And atonement is done on the cross. So this is important because that is the only way, right, we can understand about the holiness of God without trivializing either sin's seriousness or playing down God's holiness. If we think that way, God loved me so much, He will definitely forgive me. We have either played down sin's seriousness or we have played down God's holiness. If sin is indeed serious and God is indeed holy, there will be a gap that we will not be able to bridge unless Jesus comes along and die for our atonement. And that is the significance. When we understand God's holiness and the seriousness of our sin, we recognize that unless a perfect mediator come along and bridge this gap, we will never be able to have God's holy presence in our midst. And that is the focus. The gospel, therefore, is utterly meaningless. There is no point talking about God's grace if we don't first understand God's holiness. And this is important because a lot of times we communicate God's grace, right, as God's leniency. God is okay lah, God love me, God is okay with it. When you think about God's grace that way, right, we cheapen the whole idea of grace. God's grace must always be understood in the backdrop of His holiness. God is intensely holy, and man's sin and man's imperfection is glaringly obvious. And the only way for gap to be bridged is that God came down to bridge the gap on our behalf. And then we are able. The whole gospel focuses on how God came and bridged the gap on our behalf. So without understanding the intensely holiness of God, the gospel is simply just leniency, cheapened grace. So for us to truly understand the gospel, we really need to come and re-understand the concept of God's holiness through the book of Leviticus. The people of God, the Israelites, learned about God's holiness through the book of Leviticus, because throughout the book there is a repeated emphasis: be holy because I am holy. So with that, we come to the concluding challenge. When you think about you are able to access God's presence, or you think about God's presence with you, why do you think you are able to have that presence with God? Why do you think God is able to come to you? Sometimes, right, we mistakenly think that God is with me because God loves me. But think about that. God loves everyone. God loves all because that is His nature. But doesn't mean that God is present in their lives. So why are you able to have God's presence in your life? Why is the Holy Spirit able to live in you, even though you are unholy? The reason is because Jesus has paid for our atonement. So that is important. So that means that whenever we think about God's presence in our life, we will never trivialize it. We will never think that it is taken for granted. We will remember it took the blood of Jesus to allow the holy presence of God to live in my life. I pray that as we wrap this up, we pray that we will continue to consider the holiness of God. So as we wrap up this whole entire session, these 2 sessions on the Leviticus 1 to 16, we understand that basically the whole message of Leviticus 1 to 16, the sacrifices speak about how people are supposed to approach God's presence. The priesthood focus on the idea we need a qualified and acceptable mediator on our behalf. And lastly, the atonement focuses on the idea that our impurity can only be covered over by atonement. Somebody must pay for it to cover over our impurity. At the end of the day, the Bible therefore focuses on the idea that how these are all object lessons so that people know how to think and consider about God's holy presence. So, as we summarize and conclude, the book of Leviticus therefore focuses on this. The second half of Leviticus, when we do it next time, we're going to focus on therefore how are people representing God supposed to reflect God's holiness. But in this segment, the emphasis is this: if we do not understand God's holiness, we will not be able to reflect God's holiness. The first half of Leviticus is only focusing to help Israel appreciate what does it mean that God is holy. If we understand the first half of Leviticus, then we are able to go to the second half and understand why did God require us to be holy. The first half focuses on the theological understanding of God's holiness. So 3 major questions where we have to go back and think about ourselves. How do you approach God's presence? How do you treat God's presence? Are you careful before God? 2, why do you need Jesus as your mediator? In your concept of salvation, why do you need Jesus as your mediator? Why do you need Jesus to be the go-between between you and God? 3, what needs to be done? In your idea, what needs to be done for you to be able to access God's presence? Is it a given for everybody? Or that Jesus has to pay a high price to gain you access into the presence of God? So with that, that is our concept, our whole lesson of our first part of our Leviticus 1 to 16. As we come back for the next time, as we return back, we're going to study the second half. But before that, we pray that we will continue as a people of God. We will continue to wrestle and come to a deeper understanding of God's holiness.